Deathworld training went wrong when humans began enjoying it. If the Cult 3 atmospheric processor ever decided to stop groaning, the silence would probably kill more people than the falling debris. The mile-high tower of rusted Vun-Thal alloy swayed with a rhythmic, sickening lurch as the moon's tectonic plates ground together far below. Orlov ignored the vertigo, bracing his heavy-set frame against the vibrating maintenance gantry. His oil-stained salvage harness bit into his shoulders, but his flint-like eyes were focused entirely on the recruit trembling in front of him. The kid's oxygen valve was hissing, a thin stream of precious air escaping into the caustic yellow haze of the atmosphere. Orlov reached out with thick, calloused fingers, his movements methodical despite the way the metal walkway screamed under the strain of 1,000 tons of shifting metal. He gave the seal a sharp, practiced twist, feeling the threads bite and the leak vanish. He patted the recruit's shoulder with a heavy hand, the gesture more about stability than comfort. "Stay focused on the torque, not the height," Orlov muttered, his voice a low rasp that barely carried over the mechanical thunder of the processor. "If you let the scale of this place get inside your head, you are already dead." The elevator platform hissed as it rose from the lower levels, carrying Jora up to the dizzying heights of the primary gantry. She stepped off the lift with the practiced grace of someone who had spent too many years on unstable decks, though she couldn't help but tuck a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear as the wind whipped through the structure. Her dark blue hegemony-issue uniform was crisp, save for a frayed hem that spoke of long shifts in these industrial hellscapes. She held a flickering data slate close to her chest, her expression tight and analytical. "Orlov, the hegemony has updated the schedule," she said, her voice cutting through the industrial din with a sharp, professional edge. He turned, his limp more pronounced on the uneven grading as he approached her. Jora didn't wait for him to complain about the timing. "They are demanding a tectonic collapse simulation in the acid canyons for the next cycle. They want to see how the human subjects handle a total environmental fracture. It is a spirit breaker, Orlov. No species in the hegemony archives has passed this without a 50% psychological attrition rate." Orlov looked out over the jagged horizon, where the Vun-Thal spires pierced the toxic clouds like the ribs of a dying giant. He knew what the canyons were like. The ground there didn't just shake. It dissolved into rivers of molten slag and pockets of pressurized gas. It was a death trap designed by an ancient, spindly race that had forgotten what it was like to walk on solid ground. "The Vun-Thal want to see us break," he said, wiping a smear of grease across his forehead. "They think because their own ancestors turned into jelly the moment the floor moved, we will do the same." He looked back at Jora, nodding the flicker of genuine concern in her eyes that she tried so hard to mask with her official duties. "Tell them we will be ready. But tell them, if their drones get too close to my people during the tremors, I won't be responsible for any accidental salvage." Jora nodded slowly, already recording his compliance, though the weight of what she was asking them to do clearly pressed on her. The simulation began 3 hours later under a sky the color of a bruised lung. Titan and Emily led the primary squad into the depths of the acid canyons, their reinforced thermal suits glinting against the obsidian walls. Orlov watched from the rim, his hand resting on the hilt of a mag wrench, while Jora stood beside him, monitoring the biometric feeds on her console. The first tremor hit with the force of an orbital strike. The canyon floor buckled, a massive fissure opening just yards from Emily's position. Instead of the screams Jora expected, the comms channel filled with a sharp, rhythmic counting. Titan was shouting numbers, timing the oscillation of the rock plates. On 3, he roared, his voice booming with a terrifying lack of fear. The ground shifted, a vein of glowing magma erupting in the gap, and Jora gasped as she watched the humans leap. They didn't just jump. They soared across the heat-shimmering void with a precision that looked more like choreography than survival. Emily landed on a tilting spire of basalt, her boots skidding for a second before she found her purchase. "Nice air, Titan," she laughed, the sound bubbling through the radio. "I bet I can clear the next one with a full rotation." Orlov felt a cold sweat break out on his neck, but not from the heat of the canyon. He leaned over Jora's shoulder, seeing the Vun-Thal observation drones hovering like silver insects above the squad. He reached for his comlink, his thumb hovering over the broadcast button. "Mask the audio," he hissed to Jora. "If the hegemony hears them laughing, they will think the atmosphere scrubbers are leaking hallucinogens. They don't understand joy in the face of extinction." Jora's fingers flew across her interface, frantically scrambling the vocal frequencies into white noise and distorted grunts, trying to hide the fact that her subjects were treating a lethal tectonic event like a high-stakes game of tag. Despite the danger, the humans were thriving in the chaos. Titan moved with a heavy, deliberate power, using the momentum of the shifting Earth to propel himself toward the next objective. He was the strongest of the group, a man who viewed a collapsing mountain as a personal challenge. He checked his wrist-mounted display, where a small, hand-written list of names and numbers was taped to the casing. He was trailing Emily by 2 successful jumps, and the competitive fire in his eyes was visible even through his visor. The ground groaned again, a massive section of the canyon wall shearing off to create a temporary bridge over a lake of boiling chemicals. It was a window of opportunity that would only last seconds before the pressure equalized and the bridge vanished into the depths. Titan didn't hesitate. He began to sprint, his heavy boots thudding against the vibrating stone. Orlov watched the telemetry with growing dread. The Vun-Thal sensors were sensitive to more than just movement. They tracked heart rates, adrenaline spikes, and neurological firing patterns. On his screen, Titan's vitals were off the charts, but not in the way the occupiers expected. There was no cortisol spike associated with terror, only the sharp, jagged peaks of extreme physical exertion and predatory focus. "He's going for the void jump," Orlov whispered, his voice thick with realization. "He's going to try and bridge the primary rift while the plates are still colliding." Jora looked up from her screen, her face pale. "If he misses, the pressure alone will crush his suit. If he makes it, the Vun-Thal will see a human doing something physically impossible for a stressed organism." She tried to recalibrate the sensors to dampen the readings, but it was too late. Titan launched himself into the air, a silhouette against the fire, clearing a 50-foot gap just as the 2 tectonic plates slammed together with a sound like a world breaking. The impact sent a shockwave through the canyon that knocked the observation drones off their flight paths. Titan tumbled onto the far ledge, rolling to his feet and punching the air in a silent victory. He looked back at the gap, his chest heaving, and scrawled a new number onto the tape on his wrist. But the victory was short-lived. On Jora's console, a series of red icons began to flash with violent intensity. The Vun-Thal Central Intelligence had flagged the event. The biometric data was being analyzed by the ancient minds in the apex spires, and the conclusion was already forming in their cold, logical processors. Jora's hands shook as she read the scrolling Vun-Thal script. "Orlov, they've flagged the entire squad. The jump was too precise, the heart rate too stable. They are classifying the human nervous system as neurologically unstable. They think the lack of fear is a sign of a terminal malfunction in our species." The facility's alert sirens began to wail, a mournful, low-frequency drone that signaled the beginning of a purge. The Vun-Thal didn't repair broken tools, they incinerated them. Jora's fingers danced across the holographic interface, her eyes widening as the scrolling Vun-Thal glyphs shifted from an amber warning to a deep, pulsating violet. The command came through with the chilling detachment of a civilization that had outlived its own empathy. She had been ordered to finalize a decommissioning report for the entirety of Cult 3, a document that would serve as the formal death warrant for every human on the moon. In the cold logic of the hegemony, the humans were no longer viable subjects, but erratic variables that threatened the stability of the ancient processing hub. She felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach as she realized the orbital purge was not a distant threat, but a scheduled event, set to trigger the moment her report was uploaded. Every breath she watched the recruits take on her monitors was now a countdown, and the weight of being the one to sign their names into the incinerator's ledger made her hands tremble until she had to clasp them together to stay still. Later that evening, the heavy scent of recycled air and hydraulic fluid filled the cramped, dark confines of a maintenance crawlspace deep beneath the spires. Orlov was already there, his heavy frame squeezed into the narrow gap between a vibrating coolant pipe and a wall of rusted circuitry. He looked up as Jora slid into the space, his flint-like eyes searching her face for any sign of hope. Without a word, he reached into his oil-stained harness and pulled out a crumpled, grease-smeared piece of paper. It was the high score list, a frantic tally of jumps, repairs, and survival times that the recruits kept like a holy relic. Jora took it, her fingers brushing his calloused hand, and in exchange, she pressed a decrypted data chip into his palm. The chip contained the technical schematics for the moon's failing gravity stabilizers, raw data she had siphoned from the High Command's private servers at the risk of her own life. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic thud of the distant atmospheric processors. Jora leaned back against the cold metal, her professional facade finally cracking under the pressure of what she had discovered. "They are dying, Orlov," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the mechanical groans of the station. "The Vun-Thal aren't the masters of this technology anymore. They are just its ghosts. They don't understand the machines they inherited from their ancestors. They see our people surviving, laughing at the danger, and it terrifies them because they have forgotten how to be anything but fragile." She looked at the data chip in his hand, a flicker of resentment crossing her sharp features. "They want to purge the colony because they think we are broken, but the truth is that they are the ones who can't function. They are a race in a zero-G chair watching a marathon they no longer have the legs to run." Orlov didn't answer immediately, his thumb tracing the jagged edge of the data chip. He thought of the recruits of Emily and Titan, and the way they had turned a lethal tectonic collapse into a playground. He realized then that their defiance wasn't just a survival tactic. It was an accidental insult to a species that had traded its vitality for the cold comfort of ancient automation. "We aren't failing their tests, Jora," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "We are breaking their worldview. They built this place to harvest our fear, to study how a lesser species wilts under pressure. When we didn't wilt, we became a glitch in their system." He tucked the chip into a secure pocket of his gray thermal suit, his mind already working through the technical hurdles of the gravity stabilizers. "If they want a malfunctioning species, I suppose we should give them one that knows how to take the engine apart." The next morning, the Vun-Thal initiated a vacuum exposure drill in the primary hub, a simulation intended to test the speed and psychological resilience of the human response teams during a hull breach. Emily led the squad into the decompression chamber, but instead of the frantic scramble for emergency masks the Vun-Thal expected, the humans moved with a playful, synchronized efficiency. Emily stood by the primary airlock seal, her hand hovering over the manual override lever. She caught Titan's eye and grinned, her reflection shimmering in the reinforced glass. "On the mark," she shouted, her voice crisp and full of a strange, competitive energy. They weren't just sealing the breach. They were timing their movements to the millisecond, turning the life-or-death task into a game of precision. As they slammed the seals home with rhythmic thuds, the screeching alarm of a thermal leak that had been draining the hub's power for months suddenly cut to silence. Without knowing it, their recreational speedrun had perfectly aligned the docking clamps, repairing a structural flaw the Vun-Thal drones had been unable to locate. From the observation deck, Jora watched the power levels on the station's main grid spike into the green for the first time in a decade. The humans were cheering, slapping each other's armored shoulders, oblivious to the fact that they had just performed a miracle of engineering in the name of a high score. Her gaze shifted to the Vun-Thal overseers drifting in their zero-G chairs above her. Their sensory stalks were twitching with a frantic, agitated rhythm. They didn't see the repair, they only saw the lack of panic. To the Vun-Thal, a subject that did not fear the void was a subject that could not be controlled. The senior observer turned its translucent head toward Jora, a series of clicks and whistles translating into a cold directive on her headset. The anomaly is confirmed, the voice stated, devoid of any inflection. The subjects are unresponsive to terminal stimuli. Initiate the purge sequence immediately. Document the incineration for the archives. Jora's hand hovered over the terminal, the cursor blinking over the final authorization code for the orbital strike. She looked down at the floor of the hub, where Emily was currently showing Titan a more efficient way to torque the emergency valves. They looked so small against the backdrop of the mile-high machinery, yet they were the only living things in the entire spires that seemed to possess any momentum. She thought of the high score list, of the handwritten names of people who refused to be victims. If she pressed the button, the atmospheric processors would reverse, stripping the oxygen from the moon before the orbital beams turned the surface to glass. She felt a wave of nausea, her analytical mind clashing with a sudden, fierce loyalty to the people she was supposed to be documenting. She hesitated, her finger trembling inches from the glass, as she realized that the humans were the only reason the station was even holding together. The internal conflict was a physical weight, a pressure in her chest that made it hard to breathe. She looked back at the Vun-Thal, their spindly forms silhouetted against the harsh light of the command deck. They were so certain of their superiority, so convinced that their ancient laws were the only thing keeping the universe in balance. But Jora saw the truth now. They were parasites living in the shell of a giant they no longer knew how to feed. If she followed the order, she would be destroying the only thing capable of saving the hegemony from its own slow decay. She took a deep breath, her sharp features hardening as she made a choice that would brand her a traitor to her species. Instead of entering the purge code, she began a complex bypass sequence, rerouting the command authority to a secondary terminal in the maintenance sublevels where Orlov was waiting. Orlov felt his data slate vibrate against his thigh, a signal from Jora that the window of opportunity was closing. He stood in the shadows of the secondary hub, his limp forgotten as he signaled to Titan and Emily. The training was over, but the real game was just beginning. He knew Jora had bought them minutes, perhaps only seconds, before the Vun-Thal realized their commands were being intercepted. "We have to move," he told the squad, his voice dropping into a tactical low. "The Vun-Thal have decided we are a bad batch. They are trying to turn the lights out on us." Titan's expression shifted from competitive joy to a cold, hard focus, his large hands tightening into fists. "They want to scrap us?" he asked, a dangerous edge to his words. Orlov nodded, looking up at the towering pipes that carried the moon's primary coolant reserves. "Not if we steal the keys to the house first. We're going to the reactor core, and we're going to show them exactly how much energy a human can generate when we actually have something to play for." The heavy industrial lift groaned as it descended into the bowels of Cult 3, carrying Orlov, Titan, and Emily toward the subsurface reactor core. Frost began to crystallize on the lift's safety railing, the temperature plummeting as they bypassed the residential levels. Orlov checked the seals on his gray thermal suit, his flint-like eyes fixed on a flickering holographic gauge mounted to the wall. The liquid nitrogen coolant levels were dropping steadily toward the 4% threshold, a critical failure point that would lock the atmospheric processors into a permanent death spiral. Titan was checking the torque settings on a heavy-duty salvage wrench, while Emily adjusted the straps on her oxygen pack. Orlov leaned in, his voice a low rasp against the mechanical grinding of the lift. "This isn't about the high score list anymore," he told them, his breath hitching in the thinning air. "We aren't racing for points, we are racing for the moon's equilibrium. If that coolant hits the floor, the Vun-Thal will let this whole rock freeze over just to be rid of us. We have to reach the primary bus bars before the automated lockdown triggers." High above them in the apex spires, Jora sat at her monitoring station, her sharp features illuminated by the frantic pulsing of red warning icons. The Vun-Thal overseers were already initiating the purge protocols, their spindly fingers dancing over translucent control surfaces. Jora knew she couldn't stop the orbital strike through brute force hacking, so she pivoted to a more subtle form of disruption. She began flooding the internal security network with false biometric data, making it appear as though the humans were scattering in 1,000 different directions across the acid canyon floor. She framed the system lag as a direct result of the humans' erratic, high-energy movements, masking Orlov's descent into the core. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched a Vun-Thal commander tilt its sensory stalk toward her. She didn't flinch, instead projecting an image of frustrated incompetence. "The subjects are experiencing a total neurological collapse," she reported with practiced formality. "Their unpredictable vectors are overloading the tracking subroutines. I am attempting to recalibrate, but the hardware is failing to keep pace with their kinetic output." The lift slammed into the bottom of the shaft, and Orlov led the way out into a labyrinth of massive, frost-coated coolant pipes. The air here was a lethal cocktail of sub-zero vapor and high-pressure steam venting from ancient, cracked valves. Titan and Emily followed him into the gauntlet, their movements fluid and practiced after weeks of treating the facility like an obstacle course. To any other species, this would have been a hellscape of certain death, but the recruits moved with a terrifying grace. Emily vaulted over a pressurized steam vent, her boots clanging against the rusted metal walkway as she laughed. "Level 10, she shouted, her voice echoing through the dark, frozen cavern. Titan didn't miss a beat, sliding beneath a low-hanging manifold and using his momentum to kick a jammed manual override back into position. They weren't just moving, they were flowing through the machinery, their years of salvage experience turning the hazardous environment into a familiar, high-stakes playground. Orlov kept his eyes on the relay sensors blinking in the darkness along the main conduit. He knew the Vun-Thal were still trying to watch, even through the digital fog Jora had created. As they ran, he signaled for his team to break specific glass-encased modules. "Do it accidentally," he ordered, his voice sharp over the roar of the coolant pumps. "Make it look like a clumsy collision." Titan swung his shoulder into a primary telemetry relay, shattering the delicate Vun-Thal crystals inside. Emily followed suit, her salvage harness snagging a series of optical cables and ripping them from their housing as she performed a tactical roll across a slippery floor plate. With each accident, another blind spot opened on the Vun-Thal's monitoring grid. They were erasing their trail, turning the core into a dark zone where the decaying eyes of their masters could no longer reach them. Orlov felt a grim satisfaction. The Vun-Thal had spent centuries relying on these machines, never realizing how easily a few humans with heavy boots could dismantle their perception. The air suddenly thinned further as a Vun-Thal enforcer chair descended from a hidden hatch in the ceiling, its spindly occupant bathed in a pale blue light. The alien observer chirped a series of high-pitched commands, its sensory stalks vibrating with agitation as it blocked the path to the reactor's primary cooling valves. Titan tensed, his hand going to the heavy wrench at his hip, but Orlov grabbed his arm. "No fighting," Orlov hissed, his eyes locked on the drifting chair. "If we touch them, they have the excuse they need to fire the orbital beams. We're going to play a different game. On my signal, we run the evasive delta." Orlov led the crew in a sudden, chaotic burst of movement that looked like a panic scramble to the untrained eye. They darted around the enforcer chair, their paths intersecting in a complex, dizzying weave. The Vun-Thal tried to track them, its chair spinning in frustrated circles, but the humans were too fast, too erratic. This wasn't a fight. It was a precision manual bypass. As they danced past the alien, each human struck a specific valve lever with a glancing blow, their coordinated clumsiness opening the bypass flow that the Vun-Thal didn't even know was blocked. They reached the heart of the reactor core, where a massive, hidden leak was spraying liquid nitrogen across the primary power bus bars. This was the wound that was bleeding the moon dry, a structural failure the Vun-Thal's degraded sensors had completely missed. Orlov pointed to the jagged rift in the mile-high alloy pillar. "That's the finish line," he shouted over the scream of escaping gas. "We run a demolition race. Use the thermal patches and the heavy clamps. First one to the top of the rift wins." Emily and Titan didn't hesitate. They scrambled up the side of the freezing reactor, their salvage tools sparking against the ancient metal as they hammered thermal plates into the breach. It was a recreational demolition, a frantic, joy-filled scramble that saw them laughing as they worked in conditions that would have killed a Vun-Thal in seconds. They patched the leak with the speed of a professional pit crew, their movements a blur of synchronized effort. As the final clamp snapped into place, the screaming hiss of the leak died away, replaced by the deep, steady thrum of a stabilizing system. Above them, the atmospheric processor's output surged, the oxygen levels in the colony beginning a slow, healthy climb for the first time in 30 years. Orlov stood at the base of the reactor, his gray thermal suit covered in a thick layer of frost, watching the gauges settle into the green. In the command deck, Jora saw the change immediately. She turned to the Vun-Thal overseers, her expression one of cold, professional triumph. "The reactor has stabilized," she announced, her voice ringing through the silent hall. "The humans have performed a manual restoration of the primary cooling loop. They didn't do it out of fear, and they didn't do it because you ordered them to. They did it because they turned your failing technology into a sport." Jora leaned over the primary terminal, her finger hovering over the communication link. "You can purge them and watch this moon die when the next leak happens, or you can let them stay and play their games." The Vun-Thal observers drifted in a long, silent circle, their sensory stalks drooping as they processed the data. They were a species of ghosts, and for the first time, they seemed to realize they were haunting a house they could no longer fix. The senior observer finally clicked a response, a series of symbols appearing on Jora's screen that authorized the cancellation of the orbital strike. The purge was replaced by a new standing order. The humans were to be granted total autonomy within the lower levels, provided they maintained the training routines that kept the reactor functional. It was a surrender disguised as a treaty. The Vun-Thal would have their power, and the humans would have their playground. Jora felt the weight lift from her shoulders, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of her mouth as she sent the confirmation code down to Orlov. Weeks later, the atmosphere in the apex spires had changed. The air was crisp and smelled of ozone-free, recycled oxygen. Orlov stood on the high observation gantry, his heavy frame leaning against the railing as he watched the canyon floor below. Beside him, Jora tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her dark blue uniform now lacking the formal hegemony insignia. Below them, a group of recruits led by Emily and Titan were preparing for the morning's coolant dash. They were laughing, their voices echoing up through the mile-high halls of the processor. They were racing through a series of high-pressure valves, their game ensuring that the lubricants remained fluid and the seals remained tight. It was a routine of perpetual motion, a life built on the edge of a knife. But for the first time in the history of Cult 3, the people living there weren't just surviving. They were home, and the Deathworld that was supposed to break them had become the only place in the galaxy where they truly felt alive. Orlov looked at the high score list in his hand, added a new name to the top, and smiled.